What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jays Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, Job Rants, Joe Johnson's, Jaw Raps, of course. We've got Jays. We got him for days. Josh, how you doing?
Well, this is the last time we're going to say it, but it's worth saying it again. Somehow, some way, the program that tried to cooperate with the NCAA and had a coach who was not at said program while the violations took place, working with the NCAA, ended up getting the short end of the stick in all of this FBI investigation stuff, as Kansas now also, with their 5 level 1 violations that just disappeared, have basically gotten away with nothing too.
It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. Like I don't understand. Like, I don't understand what the point of the IARPA exclamation point underscore. Like, what's the point if we're not going to punish programs when there's evidence that they did things wrong? I don't understand. It's an insult to everybody's intelligence. It really is.
Yeah. And there's just a common sense aspect of it that the way this all played out, it just doesn't line up with what the schools are being accused of, right? And this is more about arbitration than it is saying these things didn't actually happen. At least that's my feeling when talking about IARP. It fails the out loud test, to use one of your favorite phrases.
As does literally everything else in college athletics at this point. It's unsurprising, continues to be discouraging, and I don't understand what the point is if there's no, because in theory the whole point of the IRP is to take away some of the arbitration, right? Mm-hmm. That's the whole point.
Speed up the process.
And to speed up the process. We don't speed up the process.
No.
We don't do that at all. And there's no rhyme or reason case to case. Right? That's like the whole point of a jury system, is to set precedent and to follow it, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole point. Like, that's why it's so important when the Supreme Court votes on something, because it sets a precedent, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's kind of the foundation of how that is looked at for till the end of time, right? And that is, if this governing body, if this independent contractor, whatever you want to call it, if we're not establishing some sort of foundation through which we look at, and maybe the foundation we're setting is that they just don't care.
That's what I was going to say. You could argue that there is a precedent, and that is that we just don't punish people severely.
Which then again, I would ask, what's the point of the whole thing?
Right. Yeah. Not surprising, but wanted to at least acknowledge it.
Kevin Sweeney's on this podcast. We're going to talk about the Big Ten. That's a much more entertaining topic to discuss, and will be the bulk of this podcast. Kevin is all over the place. Sports Illustrated, talking college hoops. He's been around for a long time in the college basketball world, and we appreciate him hopping on the pod for a second straight year. Without any further ado, let's go talk to Kevin. Joining us now from all over the place, from Sports Illustrated, a very important member of the college basketball community, at CBB_Central on Twitter. He is Kevin Sweeney. Kevin, thanks so much for taking the time to come and chat with us for the second year in a row.
Well, it's quite the introduction. I appreciate you guys having me as always.
Big Ten, the topic of conversation on today's pod, and of course, Kevin, there's not too far we can go into this conference without talking about the elephant in the room, which is also the team that has the elephant-sized player in the room, and that's the Purdue Boilermakers. The last time we saw this team that had the National Player of the Year, that had a number 1 seed, they were losing to a 16 seed, which is not something that we see very often. how much do you put that Purdue's lost to FDU kind of into your thought process about how you're thinking about Purdue this season? Do you care at all? Is it just kind of this cloud that's hanging over the team until the season starts? How are you feeling about Purdue right now on October 6th?
Yeah, I think what's hard is that there's almost nothing that they can do during the year that will change people's minds, right? Like you either believe that this is I don't know if aberration is the right word, but it's the variance of a one-game elimination tournament, or you believe that Purdue is fatally flawed. And I don't think they've done anything really in the offseason to fundamentally change who they are. I don't think they want to. I talked to Matt Painter about a month ago and talked to Braden Smith and Zach, and it doesn't like they feel doubled down in terms of what they do. And Painter basically said to me like, hey, like we're not we can't be overreactive to one game or a few games. Yes, we have problems. It's on me, right? We've had this March issue. It hasn't been just FDU. It's not just St. Peter's. It's not just North Texas. It's a habit now. We have to fix it. But at the same time, the way we fix it is by being better at the stuff we're already good at, right? We're a really good rebounding team. Let's be even better, right? And I think that's why you'll see more Trey Kaufman run at the 4 this year. And I think he has a chance to be really good. We have good shooting. Well, we need our guards to be able to go make plays, right, and take care of the basketball a little bit better. So that's put the ball in Braden Smith's hands more and trust him more. Zach Edey is the best player in the country. Like we're not getting away from what we want to do, and I think that's a refreshing philosophy. But it also means that like the same questions are going to be there, right? I mean, Purdue was dominant last year most of the way. Yes, they had some kind of shows of weakness down the stretch, and maybe we can avoid those this year. But I really believe that it like if you're in, you're in. If you're not, you're not. And it's going to take until April 8th to determine whether anyone feels differently about Purdue.
That's exactly how I described this when we were doing our Big Ten preview. Just Josh and I is they could be entering the tournament undefeated, and there would still be people who don't especially care that they're undefeated because of what happened in the tournament. Where do you kind of fall on that? Like, is there a ceiling for how you'll feel about Purdue this year as a result? Can you just only get to a certain spot with how confident you are in that team? Is there anything they can do to kind of break that ceiling, or is there kind of just will it always be in the back of your mind?
I think it has to be in the back of your mind. Look, I guess I posed the question to you guys: if Purdue had lost to FAU in the second round instead of Fairleigh Dickinson in the first.
FAU, yeah.
Yeah, there we go. If they lose to a 9 seed in round 2 instead of a 16 seed in round 1, and they bring back 5 starters from a team that won the Big Ten by 3 games, and they bring back the National Player of the Year, is there any question in anyone's minds this is the preseason number 1 team in the country? Like the fact that it's even a debate is because of the thing in the back of your mind that says FDU, right? Like they've had this true all systems failure happen. So I guess that means we can't get over it, right? Because if we could, I'd already be there, right? And I have them third nationally. Every time I look at it, I say to myself, I really should have them number 1. Every piece of logic says this is the best team in the country in the preseason. But I guess we dock them 2 spots as punishment for FDU, and we basically that's the prove it zone, right? That like the floor is incredibly high, right? Like I think we'd all be stunned if Purdue isn't like a top 2 seed. Like I don't know that we really remember teams that have such a high floor without injury, right? Obviously, if Edey went down or something crazy like that happened, changed the conversation. But I don't necessarily see a world where they don't look awesome. It's just a matter of how awesome.
And I think a big part of that you alluded to earlier is the fact that this has happened before to Purdue, not to the same extent of 16 versus 1, obviously, but you've seen the North Texas loss. They have had some disappointing showings in the tournament, as well as some good ones where, I mean, they very well may have been seconds away from a national championship with Carson Edwards. You could also say Carson Edwards is an exception, that he was just so good during that tournament. There's nothing you could do about it. But I just don't put stock into NCAA tournament results for the most part. But I think the flip side of that is you also have to take into consideration that it is just a different set of skills that you need to be able to survive the chaos of 6 single elimination games. And so when you don't put stock into it for the regular season, it's then fair to wonder, does a team that's built the way Purdue is have what is needed to win in the tournament? So I always just separate the two to answer your question. You can be the best team in the country. It doesn't mean you're the national championship favorite to me.
So let me give you like a half-baked take that's been like rattling around my brain and has not actually been shared on any other platform yet. So maybe this is an exclusive for you guys. And I think it's a good way to kind of get into the lash of the Big Ten. So everyone thinks of the Big Ten as like, oh, it's all big men. The guard play is not great. You know, it's physicality, it's toughness, it's winning the half court, and that's why teams aren't winning in March. Like, look around the Big Ten this year outside of Zach Edey and name the like traditional center that's like a traditional like the Big Ten center of old, right? Other than Cliff O'Morey, I don't know.
That was gonna be my answer,
right? Like Khalil Ware is really talented, but he's very much the modern big man who can run the floor and shoot it, and like if he lives up to the hype, it's because of his skill set, not because of raw physicality. Right, like I'm just looking at my depth charts right now. The centers I have projected in the Big Ten: Coleman Hawkins, Khalil Ware, Ben Krikke at Iowa, Terrace Reed, Rink Mast at Nebraska, Zed Key. Like the Big Ten is not a great big man's league this year. On the other hand, the guards are as good as it's been in a long time. Right, you have Jameer Young, Boo Buie, like proven awesome point guards. Ace Baldwin at Penn State's a really good point guard. Bruce Thornton at Ohio State, I think, is really good. Hogard and Tyson Walker at Michigan State, right? Even like Wisconsin with like adding AJ Storr and bringing back Chucky, Asijan, and Klesmit. Like, I think the guard, Xavier Johnson as well. Like, I think the guards are a lot better. So maybe this year's Big Ten is a better proving ground for Purdue than it has been in years past. And maybe it will produce a little bit better March results, because you look around and you say, well, when's the March guard play? That's the common refrain. Well, I think the Big Ten has guard play this year for the first time in a really long time.
The arc of that backcourt last year was so intriguing, right? We kind of went from early in the season, it was, oh my gosh, look at what Matt Painter is doing with this true freshman backcourt. Right. I can't believe that he's turning this, and it was a good backcourt in terms of recruiting, but it wasn't a great one. I mean, Fletcher Lawyer, spectacular, Braden Smith, both of those guys, Indiana, Mr. Basketball finalists. And I think it was Braden who was who won Mr. Basketball his senior year in high school. But it was like, man, I can't believe that they're so under control. They're so collected. And it kind of slowly moved in the opposite direction. And as we got into Big Ten play, and as we got into, tournaments, and then of course what happened in the tournament happened. What do you think is fair to expect from those two guys in particular in this season? And what kind of, is that the number one thing in terms of making Purdue maybe less vulnerable to what happened in the tournament last year, or is it something else?
Yeah, so I had asked Painter that, particularly in the context of Braden Smith. And Painter has said really since the beginning. I mean, I remember at PK 85 last year, he was saying, like, I want Braden to be more score first. He's good as a pass first point guard. He's great as a score first point guard who can pass. And you never really saw that side of his game. And I asked Painter, I was like, where does that stand? He said, yeah, that's what we need. Like, he doesn't have to be Carson Edwards, but he has to be a guy that can go make a shot in a big game and that we can trust with the ball in his hands. And I think he's on his way to doing that. I think Braden Smith took a lot of heat last year that wasn't necessarily deserved. Like, yes, he turned the ball over too much against Fairleigh Dickinson. He was not the only reason they lost. Yes, he turned the ball over at the end of the game against Northwestern. But he also started a point guard on a top 5 team in the country and averaged 2.2 assists to turnover ratio. Like, that's awesome. If you look at the numbers here, and I'll pull these up because just was interacting the other day about this exact debate. Right, two freshman guards from last year. Player A is 9.7 points per game, 4.2 rebounds, 4.4 assists, shot 43% from the field, 44% from the field, 38 from three, and 87 from the line. Player B is 9.4 points per game, 3.1 rebounds, 3.3 assists on 38, 32, 87. Player A is Braden Smith. Player B is Tyrese Proctor. Tyrese Proctor is a consensus top 10 player in the sport, according to all the experts. Braden Smith's not even top 100. And yes, I think Tyrese Proctor is certainly more talented. Like, there's more pro upside. I get that. But I feel like Braden Smith has just gotten, like, railroaded all offseason for no reason. Like, Braden Smith is on track to having, like, a all-time Big Ten basketball career if he, like, keeps at this rate. And I think people talk about him like he's, like, some massive question mark. Like, yes, he has to play well in March. It's critical. He's the point guard of a top 5 team. But I think, like, I think it's just gotten so out of hand because everyone's looking for a label for, like, the non-Edey problem. Like, who's the issue? And Braden's the guy with the ball in his hands. To me, it's so unfair.
I think the only argument against that is if you just look at the trajectories of their 2 seasons, the fact that Proctor reclassified, you could make this case that Proctor is on a higher upward trajectory just because Braden Smith started so well, which is also a compliment to Braden Smith. But that is a very interesting and valid point.
I agree with you, and I wouldn't say that Braden Smith's a top 10 player in the country. I'm not sure I'd say Proctor. I would have no issue with Proctor over Smith. I have the issue being that like they're in like 3 different tiers. They're like 3 tiers apart. Like, to me, that's crazy.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, the narrative surrounding them is completely different. Yeah. Is there one final kind of Purdue question before we get to the rest of the conference? It does seem like Matt Painter is taking the approach of, similar to Tony Bennett, we're going to own this. We're going to own the fact that we have not delivered in March. We're not going to change our identity, but also we need to do some things differently to try and enhance our success specifically in March. I feel like he is leading into this idea that it takes something a little bit different. Have you gotten that sense talking to him, that whether that's, I know part of that is experimenting with Trey Kaufman-Renn, it sounds like, maybe, as you alluded to, changing Braden Smith's thought process a little bit to make him more aggressive with the ball in his hands. Do you feel like we're going to not change who Purdue is because it's going to run through Zach Edey, because why in the world wouldn't it? But do you think that there is going to be at least a tweak to try and really focus on having a different team by the time you get to the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I think like you point to 3 main things, right? And you mentioned 2 of them, Kaufman-Renn and then Braden. I think the third element would be Miles Colvin. They don't really know yet what they're going to get from him, but they're excited about the possibilities. And then on paper, he really fulfills some of the holes, right? Like athletically, lengthwise, the ability to make catch and shoot threes is something that they needed last year. Just didn't make at times. Like they were literally unstoppable when open catch and shoot shots went in last year. And as much as anything, I think Banner's just hoping that like the guys they recruited who were good shooters in previous seasons go back to doing that. Because if they do that, like they're going to be a really tough out, like horribly hard to beat, because you know this team was one of the worst 3-point shooting teams in the country down the stretch last year. And like you look around, like they're not bad shooters. Like there's no non-shooters out there other than Zach. Like they should have been better. So I don't know that like we'll see some like very clear different identity like play to play. I think maybe we will later, right? Like, you know, this is probably not necessarily the fairest comparison, but I think Painter came into 2021-22 and felt like, yes, I have Travion Williams, a senior. I'm kind of stuck with him though, because I really kind of prefer Zach, and I don't know how to get away from it, right? And I don't know that he wants to get away from Zach or even get away from having elite big men, but I do think that if Zach, I do think that when Zach graduates, Purdue won't play the same as they've played for the last 10 years. Like, I think a bigger shift is coming, and part of that's recruiting and like if they have Cam Catchings and Miles Colvin, like that's a wildly different looking roster than Purdue has had in a long time. That's length, that's athleticism, that's NBA talent. So I think that's kind of where it's heading, is like, how do we become more guard oriented? How do we become more athletic? But I think for this year, I think the hope is just we have the best player in the sport, a guy who quite frankly could go down as a top 5 to 10 player in the history of the sport if he wins National Player of the Year again. Mm-hmm. We're going to lean into that, and we're going to embrace the fact that we have the guys around them that we believe can win us a championship, and hope that the chips fall right in March.
I spent most of last college basketball season working at a radio station in Indianapolis and spent a lot of time cutting Matt Painter audio. And it just, I say that to say that he talked about that a lot, the shooting thing especially. It's like, we just need our good shooters to make shots. And rather than it being a question of we don't have any shooters on this team, we just need the guys that we brought here to make shots, and that we have seen make shots on other college basketball teams and in a Purdue uniform in the past. We just need them to make shots again. Like, we have the nucleus, we have the guy that you're not going to be able to stop. It's just those little things that make us, like you said, if open shots were going down from guys not named Zach Edey, they were very, very, very difficult to stop. The other team that kind of jumps off the page from the Big Ten this year is one Michigan State and East Lansing, a team that brings back a lot from last year. We've mentioned, a handful of them, whether it's Tyson Walker, AJ Hoggard in that backcourt, Jaden Akins, Malik Hall, and then there's a slew of attractive freshmen, namely Xavier Booker being kind of the headline act of that group. And we talked to Brandon Marks about the ACC yesterday, and it's kind of a roster that has the same sexy feel that like a Duke team does, that's bringing back a ton of production and then has the recruits that are jumping off the page at the same time. What are you excited about what could happen in East Lansing this year? How much are you buying in? Because on the other side of the equation is this was a 21-13 team last year that finished with 11 wins in the Big Ten, and basically everybody finished with something between 9 and 11 wins in the Big Ten. And if their freshman production is not substantial, then it's a team that looks really, really similar to the one that Izzo put on the floor last year. So Michigan State, what do you think about them right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, like when you take the national view of it, once you get past Duke, Kansas, and Purdue, who I think is everyone's kind of consensus top 3 in some order, you run quickly out of teams that feel like sure things, right? And so the team that runs it back and has Tom Izzo and has a top 5 recruiting class, it becomes pretty easy to just we're gonna sprinkle them in between 4 and 7, right?
Sure, yeah.
We're we're human. I think the floor is a little lower with them than the top 3 teams in the country, but we also have seen that the floor is pretty high, and that again, they're not going to be worse than they were last year. And last year they're like a 6 seed and fringe top 25 team and go to the second weekend of the NCAA tournament. I think they were a 7, but whatever.
Yeah.
Tomato. Like Michigan State's floor this year is probably like a 5 or a 6 seed nationally. That would be a pretty disappointing season, I think, because I think the hope is that the continuity really is impactful with them. And that's something that Izzo's been working towards, right? I think we all remember 2 years ago when he came in like scorched earth at media day about the portal and, I'm good. Or it was last year, actually. God, time flies. I don't need the portal. I don't need this. Like, Mady Sissoko's my starting center, and who cares? And it worked enough, right? I think it's an interesting conversation, right? Because I think the narrative is, Izzo proved everybody wrong. He got a 7 seed, he went to Sweet 16, all that. On the other hand, they lost games because they weren't deep enough, right? And maybe the aggregate chemistry bump or whatever we're discussing here makes up for that. I don't know. I'm not in the locker room every day, but it would have helped Michigan State to have a proven backup center last year. It would have helped Michigan State to have one more guard they could trust, right? And I think the idea here is all right, now we've got these freshmen. Fears is awesome. Cohen Carr is awesome. Booker is super talented. I think it's going to take him some time, but he's gives him upside certainly. the idea is like, all right, now we have the athleticism, we have the depth, we have the talent level we need to be an elite team, and we've got all this experience in the starting lineup. And that's a pretty potent combination. I think the one thing I point to with Michigan State, like the bellwether of sorts of like, is this team getting there? Is the elite Tom Izzo teams have always been elite at defending the rim. Tweeted this the other day. Like you look like 2016 to 2020 when they were top 10 in KenPom every year. They were top 10 in 2-point defense every year, or maybe missed 1 year. That thing was very consistently like you just could not score on them at the basket. The last 3 years, they've lost 13 games each of the past 3 years. They've been over 100th in 2-point defense each year. Enter Xavier Booker. Maybe that changes the conversation a little bit because he is athletic. He can move his feet. He can protect the rim a little bit. Now, do I trust Xavier Booker to single-handedly make this a top 10 rim defense? No. And I also think that there's some issues, like they're smaller in the backcourt. That makes it harder to defend guards, can keep them contained, keep them from getting to the rim, things like that. But this team has to be like a top 50 2-point defense, in my opinion, if we're going to talk about them as an elite team in the country.
Before we move on to everybody else, how do you kind of view these two teams in conversation with each other and in the national title conversation? Do you feel like these two teams could very well both be there when we get to a Final Four and the Big Ten is in a good position to finally end this drought? Or do you feel like Purdue is the singular hope and it's kind of Boilermakers or bust in terms of the Big Ten finally really cementing itself back on the national stage and not just having a team get to a Final Four, but a team get to a national championship game and feeling like Purdue is, for example, the best team in the country from start to finish kind of thing?
Yeah, I think Purdue is clearly better than Michigan State on paper. Like, I think there's only going to wind up being 2 or 3 spots nationally different in my rankings. But, like, if you're power rating it, right, like if I was a sports book, like I play them on a neutral court, I think Purdue's like a 5-point favorite in my mind, right? Like, I think it's pretty clear. Now, that being said, who's better set up to win in March? That's a question I would entertain, right? Like, I still think it's Purdue because I think they're better. But you couldn't really script a more steady March story than having 3 veteran, extremely talented guards, an elite coach, and McDonald's All-American level talent, right? And that's what Michigan State has. They have Tyson Walker, A.J. Hogarth, and Jaden Akins. They have a top 5 recruiting class, and they have one of the best coaches who's ever done it in college basketball. Like, check. That's March. That's the NCAA tournament for you. So I feel good that the league has a good March, particularly with its top 2. I think there's a good chance to get 1 or 2 teams into the Final Four.
So moving on to the rest of the conference, I want to start with this question. Which teams/coaches do you feel like have the most riding on this season? Because I feel like, and we talked about this in our preview, there's a very interesting list of things going on here. From Painter getting one more go with Zach Edey. Izzo, will he ever have a team with this combination of talent and experience? We talked about them. Indiana going in the right direction, but also lose Trace Jackson Davis, and that is a massive, massive deal. Kevin Willard, great first year. Can you continue to build on that? Juwan Howard at Michigan, Chris Holtmann at Ohio State. You can go on and on about just all of the programs and interesting spots in this conference. Who do you feel like is kind of at the top of the pressure cooker, if you will, that needs to have a good season here?
Yeah, so I'm not going to do like the hot seat angle to this where you'd say, Ben Johnson, maybe Juwan, maybe Holtmann. I think there's 2 guys who have really interesting trajectory-defining seasons. And that's Brad Underwood at Illinois and Greg Gard at Wisconsin, right? So Underwood wins 2 Big Ten titles. Everybody's happy. Last year, the March success isn't quite there. Okay, we're a little anxious, but we're okay. We're rolling in recruiting. We get Matt Meyer. We're good, right? Then last year happens, and I don't think Brad handled it the best. Like, I think he realized very early he didn't have the type of guys he wanted. And I think it was just a slog the rest of the way. And there was a lot of discontent in that locker room. It just wasn't very fun to be around that Illinois basketball team last year. And I think they really think they've got it fixed. but it's the last year of Terrence Shannon. It's the last year of Coleman Hawkins. I know people have mixed opinions of Coleman Hawkins, but two really big time players are going to graduate after this year. So last year, Guerrier and Domask, your two big transfers. Like, Illinois goes out this year. They compete for a Big Ten championship. They win multiple NCAA tournament games. Things are great, right? Brad Underwood reestablished himself as one of the best coaches in the league. Brad Underwood keeps it rolling. Like, boom, done. Have another 9 seed type of year. Don't do anything. Don't move the needle. I don't think it's hot seat, but it certainly feels like we've reached the ceiling, right? Like, this is who we are as a program right now under Brad Underwood, and that's when hot seat stuff starts getting discussed. Is when you feel like you haven't, hit where you need to get to. And then Wisconsin, kind of the same thing, right? Guard wins Big Ten title. Everybody's happy. Last year, I think it was obvious they didn't have the talent level in the preseason. A lot of people ignored that because it was we got to trust Wisconsin. They figure it out. They always do. And it came back to bite them. You have any injuries. Like, the margin of error was so slim with Wisconsin last year because they just did not have the dudes. And this year, theoretically, they have more talent, right? Storr should help them there. The freshmen, I think, could help them there with Blackwell, Yalden, and Nolan Winter, right? Like, they need to show that they're getting it right on a talent basis and get back into the top 25 contention, right? It was striking to me. I watched all 40 minutes of both Northwestern Wisconsin games last year. Northwestern was just clearly more talented. And you can say what you will, like, oh, what a great year by Chris Collins, you can angle it however way you want to spin it. But Northwestern should never be more talented than Wisconsin, right? Wisconsin should be able to recruit at a higher level. Wisconsin has shown in football that they're willing to expand their horizons a little bit, go get Luke Fickell, get out of the Wisconsin way, Paul Chris, we're going to grind it out, we're going to do this, whatever, we're going to have a full back, right? Like, there is an understanding that they have to modernize to succeed. And I think it's important for Greg Gard that he proves that the formula from Bo Ryan still works in Madison.
Illinois is such a great example of the reality for most college basketball programs. Duke has a crappy year after a bunch of high level recruits come in. Okay, we'll have another really high level recruiting class, and there are a couple teams that fit that bill. But most teams, you hit on an era that has guys like Kofi Coburn and Ayodesumu, and then you parlay that into a recruiting class that looks like the one you had heading into last season, one with Sky Clark and Jaden Epps and Ty Rogers, and just there's all of that momentum. And even if the tournament stuff, like you mentioned, doesn't look spectacular yet, oh well, you're just kind of in the majority. That most people's tournaments don't look all that awesome, especially in the Big Ten. And then you kind of hiccup, and then you have Quincy Guerrier comes in, but nobody jumps off the page in recruiting really. And you look ahead to 2024, and that's kind of the case too, that you just kind of have to keep parlaying. If you're not Duke, Kentucky, and Kansas, you have to keep turning good eras into good recruiting classes and hoping that the ball continues to roll, because you can kind of run out of steam if you're not careful. What are some of the other teams that you're looking at in terms of, we talked about kind of those Michigan State and Purdue being at the top of this conference. If there's a team that's going to challenge those two teams and make them at least uncomfortable in terms of whether it's Michigan State kind of sitting in that second spot, or if things don't go well for Purdue, like making them still win 15 games to win the conference, like that kind of thing. And then just, the conversation about who's the third best team in this conference in general. Where do you kind of go in terms of that next, even if there's a substantial gap to tier 2, who's kind of leading that second tier of this conference?
Yeah, so I think I have Illinois 3 and Wisconsin 5, two teams I just mentioned. I think Maryland, just next to each other on my depth chart. Maryland is the team I have 4th, that I think really has the higher floor of Illinois and Wisconsin. I don't know that they quite have the ceiling, although they do have some interesting freshmen with Deshaun Harris-Smith and Jamie Kaiser, two guys I loved on the circuit. It'll be interesting. I mean, I think Maryland should be very good. They're very old. They're talented enough. with, obviously Harris Smith being a potential one and done. You have a fifth-year point guard. You have two good bigs. Like, those are things that like resonate with me. But I also think what's so interesting about them is that they didn't really go all in this spring. Like, Kevin Willard operated this spring either as though he only had NIL money to pay Jameer Young, or that he really wanted to just complement with role players, right? He didn't want too many cooks in the kitchen. He knew he had enough talent. Now he just needed guys who could play roles, right? So you bring in Chance Stevens from Loyola Marymount as your backup point guard / shooter, right? He averaged 6 points a game at Loyola Marymount. Like you could shoot higher, right? Like, Minnesota's backup point guard recruit in the portal was better than Chance Stevens on paper. But Chance Stevens might be a better role player. He's an amazing catch and shoot guy. David Cox recruited him at URI, things like that, right? They added Mady Traore from New Mexico State, who's like a long-term development front court player, right? Like, they did not go all in, push the chips in. How do we get another transfer? How do we go? Like, even Geronimo from Indiana is just like a glue guy, athletic combo forward, right? I felt like they were going to go for the kill and go get a wing, like go recruit a high-end portal wing and see where the chips fall. And they went a different approach, and I think it could pay off for them because I think they have exactly what they need roster-wise. But they're also vulnerable, and that one injury could really derail things in a hurry.
If there's a team that's going to surprise people in a good way or a bad way, who do you feel like is being improperly talked about that is either going to catch people by surprise in a good way of overachieving, or that you feel like is getting a little bit too much hype and a little bit too much love?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think the team I would point to here is Michigan, and that I think the vibes of the Michigan offseason were substantially worse than like the actual product of the Michigan offseason, right? Like, the sky felt like it was falling, right? You lose Dickinson, you have the two guys go pro, all of a sudden the Caleb Love disaster. But when you like actually take a step back and look, you got one of the better transfers in the portal in Olivier Kamua, a guy who can be an all conference level player in the Big Ten. You brought back two really good freshmen turning to sophomores in Doug McDaniel and Terrace Reed, guys who I think have a chance to develop into all Big Ten level dudes. Maybe there's a little bit lacking in terms of like total talent, total depth, unless you're really buying like an Amari Burnett breakthrough, or you really like, the freshman that they brought in internationally, Lee Aliyah, I believe is the pronunciation. Apologies if not. Like, to me, I have them as like a bubble team, but Michigan's one of those teams where like it wouldn't surprise me at all if they just like kind of sneakily wind up in the top 25 in like late December, and all of a sudden everybody's like, oh my gosh, how did this happen? It's like, they're still talented. Like yes, last year was a disappointment. And yes, I think Juwan Howard has some stuff to prove to us right now, because the last two seasons, ignoring one good weekend in March, have been really, really bumpy, right? And we need to see some consistency in the regular season. But I also think that people wrote the obit before they actually looked at the roster.
It is one of those rosters I'm like, oh, okay. Oh, okay. I like that name. I like that name too. I think what's hurting at least the way that people talk about that program right now is, you're right. You look at the key departures and you look at the guys coming in, and the names jump off. The names jump off the page in terms of the guys that are leaving. And I think sometimes we're kind of susceptible to that it's like, oh, it doesn't matter what you brought in, you lost Hunter Dickinson. I'm not
right. It's not a math problem, right? Like, I think, right. and I think that's the initial thing that everyone tries to do is like, and I remember doing this when I was first starting. Like, it's like, oh, well, they lost more than they gained, so it's automatically they're going to be worse, whatever. It's like, you gotta really try to just evaluate what's in front of you, right? Like, yes, there's going to be a little bit of anchoring because of like, here's what you did last year with what you had, but Michigan has enough. Like, this team is not untalented.
We've discussed this possibility that, especially the way things went the past couple seasons, there might even be some value in just not having to build your team around Hunter Dickinson anymore for whatever reason. Obviously, he's a great player, but it just wasn't working these past couple years. He was terrific that first year in particular, and the team gelled really well. But we've sort of tossed that idea around that it might be nice for Juwan Howard to just kind of have a blank slate and to sort of hit the reset button. Do you think there's any validity to that, especially when you have an Olivier Kamwa coming in that is able to not produce at the same level, but put up numbers and really impact games at the high major level for a top 25, top 15 program?
Yeah, I think the relationship had run its course, right?
Yeah.
And it's good for Michigan to move on. I think it would have been awkward to try to rebuild around Hunter this spring, right? Like, can you imagine if this team was Caleb Love and Hunter Dickinson? The sheer chaos it would have produced. I think it would have been really hard for them to approach this year with Hunter. So I do agree with that assessment. Like, I think Hunter took a lot of blame because he's so vocal and so out there for things that weren't his fault, right? It's not Hunter Dickinson's fault that Jet Howard didn't like boxing out. It's not Hunter Dickinson's fault that they largely didn't have a point guard for 2 years, right? Like, that's on Juwan, that's on injuries, that's on luck, whatever. Like, so I think they could have built a team around Hunter that would have been very successful. But I also think it's not the worst thing to just start with a clean slate. Start with, hey, we think we have a center in Terrace Reed. We think we have a really good power forward in Kamwa. And we think we found the point guard, right? I mean, that has been a revolving door position since Xavier Simpson. And Mike Smith was better than everyone expected. Devontae Jones was probably a little worse. And then Llewellyn was an incomplete. And because of that incomplete, they finally got Doug involved. And I thought he played well. He played well enough to give them a chance to win. They were a good team down the stretch last year, and Doug was a big part of that. So to me, like, I liked the fact that maybe we have point guard, maybe we have a 5, maybe we have a 4, right? If you have those 3 positions in good shape, they have enough rolls of the dice on the wings that I think they'll be okay. And I think that's a big deal.
Speaking of programs that were built around one guy and that guy is no longer there anymore, I think for me, at least, one of the more interesting off seasons, at least in terms of, okay, this team has momentum. This team brought in guys that look like they could help continue the momentum, but I'm still not totally sure. And that's Indiana, just because of, I mean, I seriously don't think that anybody truly understands what it'll be like to play basketball at Indiana without Trace Jackson Davis on the floor. It's just been the thing that you don't have to worry about at all at Indiana the last 4 or 5. I think it was just 4 that he was actually there. Could have been 5. I don't know. They could have been 7. He could have been there for a decade. But the point being is, right, when you look at what went out the door, it's striking. It's guys like Trace Jackson Davis. It's Jalen Hood-Schifino. Race Thompson and Miller Kopp were two Big Ten basketball players that were not super sexy and highlight reel machines, but just guys that you could count on. All of those guys are gone, but you have a backcourt that starts with Xavier Johnson. You mentioned Kello Ware a little bit. Malik Renew seems to be kind of like like this guy could be something that we're just all staring at, that we don't realize quite how good he is, because he kind of fills that same role that Trace Jackson Davis did. And then there are freshmen that are substantial. Maybe it's as simple as, did we do enough at Indiana this offseason to make up for, we just talked about the math problem, but did we do enough this offseason for Indiana and Mike Woodson to be able to kind of keep the train rolling? There's still more that they can achieve, but we've kind of dug ourselves out of the Archie Miller days at Indiana. Do we think we see another step forward for Indiana this year, or is it kind of we have to re-establish our footing after losing a guy like TJD?
Yeah, it's kind of an awkward year in that, I think in general, losing what they lost, as long as you came back and were like a clear tournament team, maybe even like on the heels of the top 25, you'd call that a success. But the way they built this roster with a 5th-year point guard, with a potential NBA wing in Mbako and a potential NBA 5 in Ware, it does feel kind of like burn the boats this year. We got to win with this group. And then again, the hope is that they'll have some big name recruits with, Boogie Fland and Liam McNeely to come in 2024, but that's not done yet. They have to get that over the finish line. There's a long way to go. So there is this like weird sense of urgency for a team that on paper wouldn't necessarily need it in like the kind of life cycle of recruiting, if you will. I guess I've been down on Indiana because I'm individually lower on their 4 best players than consensus, and I was lower on them before most of them chose Indiana. Right, sure. I'm lower on Xavier Johnson than consensus. Outside of 10 games at the end of the 21-22 season, he's been pretty average as a college point guard for 5 years, and he's not a great shooter, and he's now surrounded with not a lot of shooting. Right, Mackenzie Mbako I saw play 3 times in EYBL. He had 1 amazing game and 2 really bad ones. Right, he's a mid-range jump shooter. He's not necessarily like a true floor spacer, and he's going to have some expectations about how much he has the ball and how many opportunities he gets to go shoot the basketball a game, right? And that's an issue with freshmen, right? You have Renew, who is everybody's favorite breakout star. And I think Malik Renew is like pretty average. Like I think he's really gifted, but I also watch how he processes the game. And this is something that came up with multiple Big Ten coaches when I talked to them this offseason. Like Malik Renew does not think the game at a high level. I remember this one play, it's burned into my mind. Indiana, Purdue at Mackey. Purdue's kind of trying to push to get back in that game. It's the Hood Schifino 35-point game. Purdue's got it to like 8. Crowd's on its feet. Yep. Purdue misses a shot. Or excuse me, Indiana misses a shot. All the momentum to Purdue. And Malik Renew reaches in and fouls a guy 90 feet from the rim and gives Purdue free throws. Like, what are you doing? Like, it just plays like that. And maybe that's like over salient for what he is. But I think the idea that Malik Renew is going to jump and turn into a star, to me, I'm not there. Sure. And then Khalil Ware, I was down on at Oregon. Like, I thought he should just go pro and sit in the G League and figure it out. He has all the talent in the world, but he's another guy that, like, his motor stinks. He's never really been consistent, and he doesn't know how to impact the game yet without having the ball in his hands. When you add that all together, that's why I'm like, all right, this is like a team in the 40s nationally. But a team in the 40s nationally, like, probably feels like a pretty low likelihood outcome for Indiana, if this makes sense. Like, Indiana's either going to be really good or they're going to be pretty bad. Right? Like I think you're right. I'm going to pick Indiana 7th in the Big Ten. I think it's if I could bet like top 4 like 4th or higher, 10th or lower, I would bet that over 5 to 10. Right? Like this is either going to be beautiful or it's going to be a disaster. And I'm excited to watch them. Like I think it's going to be legitimately fascinating. And if Woodson gets the most out of guys like Mbako and Ware, not only will it be a great sign for this season, but I think it's going to really heat up the recruiting machine for Indiana moving forward. But I don't think it's a guarantee just because those guys are so kind of mercurial, and I don't love the role players around them. I wish there was more shooting. I wish there was a little bit more proven ball handling outside of Johnson. It's really fascinating.
My relationship with Indiana is so it's just kind of what you're describing. I don't totally understand it. The excitement ever. They kind of keep hitting the same drum over, and part of that's probably Trace Jackson Davis. That's the guy that has to be involved in everything. But I get annoyed by programs that operate as like they're blue bloods when they're not really blue bloods anymore, even though the name on their chest might say that they are. I have a very complicated relationship with Indiana, and I think you're right. There's a lot of different ways that this can go, and it feels like them just kind of being fine and not stirring the pot in either one way or the other feels like the most unlikely outcome, which I absolutely love.
Yeah, the median outcome is not the mode outcome.
Right. Absolutely.
Glad we got some math in there. Well said.
Last thing before we kind of wrap up here, every single team was aggressively average in the Big Ten last year. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there was like everybody and their mother had somewhere between 9 and 12 conference wins. Do you think that in this season we could get a little bit more dissection of the conference, that there's a clear, maybe it's a top 4 or 5, that there's a clear top 7 and a clear bottom 7? Or is this just kind of what the Big Ten is now, that we are going to have, 9, 10 teams have somewhere between 9 and 12 wins?
Yeah, I think parity will carry the day yet again, particularly from 3 to 11 or 3 to 12, I guess, depending on how you grade out Penn State. I would probably say more 3 to 11 than 3 to 12. I think Penn State probably more fits bottom 3. But I do think it's possible. Like what happened last year was somewhat to the extreme, and that was you had a lot of teams that just had really kind of mind-bending stretches of play, both good and bad, right? Like Illinois was a better team than 11 and 9 in the Big Ten last year, right? Like they start 0 and 3 in the league, then they go 7 and 1 in their next 8 conference games, and they kind of limp to the finish, right? Like that's abnormal. Ohio State losing 10 straight is abnormal. Northwestern kind of randomly starting super hot, starting 3 and 1 and 6 and 3 in the league, winning 5 straight in February. That's very abnormal, and I say that as a Northwestern alum, right? Like there was a lot of like every time you thought you knew a team, they proved they were something different. I think it will be less of that this year. I think we'll have a little bit more stability kind of week to week, but I still think the end result will be, particularly when you're looking at like an analytical power ranking, right? When you're saying like the number 4 team in the league in KenPom and the number 10 team in KenPom, I think there's a good chance there's very little divide between those. But I think maybe we get a little bit more traditional of a hierarchy where we're not sitting at like 2 games separating 2nd and 10th like we did last year.
That's the story of the Big Ten, right? Somebody find, or a couple teams find a way to separate themselves, a couple excuse themselves, and the rest of them are kind of either pretty safely in the tournament to bubble teams, and yeah, there's just not a lot between them. And certainly looks like we're going to get that again. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for taking the time to hop on the podcast for the 2nd straight year and talk Big Ten hoops ahead of the season. Josh, this is a intriguing conference per usual, and the nature of the top of it, especially Purdue and kind of the situation they find themselves in. It's all very interesting ahead of this season.
Yeah, and I was very intrigued by the point Kevin made about the fact that the Big Ten might be set up because it's so guard heavy and is kind of an atypical version of this conference outside of Zach Edey, that maybe this is the year the Big Ten silences some of the March criticism. The other interesting part of that is when you're talking about a player like a Jameer Young, for example, who is absolutely the kind of guy that can go win a game or 2 for Maryland in the tournament, right? Get to a Sweet 16. Those aren't necessarily the title contenders. Purdue's backcourt got all kinds of criticism last season. And so those 2 things of, can you have a national title contender is one question. And then also, can the conference as a whole just perform better in March? Because I feel like we always come away disappointed in the Big Ten, teams losing earlier than they should. And you and I are both big believers in the guard theory, if you want to call it that. And I think it's a valid point Kevin made, that theoretically the Big Ten is set up to succeed in that sense. Whether that happens or not, we'll have to wait to find out.
Indeed. It's definitely not a conference that from top to bottom runs through the big man the way that it usually does. Mm-hmm. With that being said, the best team in the conference with the best player in college basketball could not be larger.
Yes.
So we'll see what that actually means, when we get to March. Josh, you got anything else?
Appreciate everybody checking out the YouTube channel. It is continuing to grow. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. That's all I got.
I've heard it's free.
How about that?
It's free. I've checked. It's free. It's great. And we'd appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button when you catch the podcast on YouTube. That's all we got for you. Please subscribe to the Jays for Days podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Jays for Days Pod. And like I said, check out and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. And we will see you later.